Now, as the country prepares for the 2024 general elections, the Legal Resources Centre has recommitted itself to fighting for social justice. The organisation says many of the injustices that led to its formation in 1979 have not been eradicated in South African society. One of the latest campaigns ahead of the 2024 polls will focus on big tech companies to be accountable, especially with the information they carry. Regional Director Sherylle joins us now to chat more about this. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. An imperative time to really iron out the importance of communication and, of course, legal activism. You've been in the field for around 45 years. As you look back and reflect on some of the highlights of the work that you've done, what stands out for you?
I think there's a lot of work that has been done over the last 45 years. I think what was distinctive as the LRC was obviously our work pre-1994 in advocating for the abolishment of apartheid, representing human rights defenders, and ensuring a just transition into a democracy. I think we were extremely instrumental in developing the Constitution, and since then we have been sort of the defenders of the Constitution, the rule of law and democracy. And a lot of our work and our cases have gone into enriching the jurisprudence around democracy and democratic values in South Africa.
What challenges do we still face? I mean, as you reflect and look back on the work of and the injustices, of 1979, and looking at what we're facing today, what do you think still stands out as a major challenge in in reaching and achieving the goals of the country?
Well, a lot of activists have said that 1994 saw the struggle for civil and political rights coming to an end, but a new struggle began for socioeconomic rights. So a lot of the challenges that South Africans have experienced in this time in our constitutional democracy is reeling around attainment and enjoyment of socioeconomic rights, which remains elusive for the majority of South Africans. What we have identified as a serious threat to democracies, and as we're leading into the elections next year, is a rising anti-rights movement, where politicians have been particularly using social media platforms in a concerted and strategic manner, not just our politicians, but globally, with the rise of authoritarianism and populist politics. Social media platforms have given them the platform to manipulate electoral processes, as well as deflecting or stamping down in civic space and closing down civic space and attacking civil rights organizations such as the LRC and other groups. We saw recently that in the past week, where 77 people lost their lives in a fire here in Johannesburg, was an example of how a tragic story can be manipulated by the use of social media to sway narratives away from state culpability to deflect blame on human rights defenders who have been advocating for housing rights. So this is, these types of dominant narratives are not an anomaly. It's a strategy employed globally by authoritarian and populist movements, which has shifted the pendulum in favor of a rising anti-rights movement, which dilutes democratic values and poses a very real threat to democracies across the globe.
So what will form the pillars or perhaps the groundwork of the Misinformation campaign?
So, we've seen this as a very serious threat to the upcoming 2024 elections. And we're not the only people. We have joined the Global Coalition of Tech Justice. It's a coalition made up of over 140 organizations worldwide. And what we want to see is a more accountable information ecosystem where the safety of users are of paramount importance, where the platforms are safe from the amplification of and disinformation, hate speech and incitements to violence. And we want to ensure that electoral processes are not manipulated through these ad tech platforms that misuse data harvested, and doesn't really lack transparency on how their system of surveillance for profit works. And so this campaign will be launched later on in September, on the 15th of September. And, and what we at the coalition is terming this the Year of Democracy, where over 70 other nations will be holding elections. And so it's a very critical year in democracies across the globe. And what we want to ensure that online platforms take more responsibility around keeping the platforms safe and free from disinformation, particularly election disinformation. We want the platforms to also be free from hate speech and incitements to violence, particularly in those countries where democracies are quite fragile.
In your call to ensure safety and responsibility from these platforms, what role do you think the media plays?
I think the media plays a very critical role. One of the major issues around mainstream media now is the competition with basically developing their own storylines. As I used the example earlier around the fire in Johannesburg, we saw how in a matter of hours, the narrative changed from a tragic story into a very political narrative around human rights defenders defending marginalized communities in accessing housing. This is a result of the influence and the power of big tech companies and social media platforms. And what we want to ensure is that journalists are being able or to promote the truth, to speak the truth, and to be able to freely report on the elections as well as other events leading up to the election.
What about the role of ordinary citizens and perhaps an educational that will need to take place there for ordinary citizens to also understand the kind of impact they can make in spreading information which may be incorrect?
I think there's different tiers of responsibilities. I think, the difference between misinformation and disinformation is quite critical. Mm-hmm. Because misinformation is really an innocent person thinking that what they are posting or what they are disseminating is actually the truth. And we saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic where users had innocently passed over misinformation or fake news as it's called. Where there is a higher standard of responsibility is around state promoting disinformation or very highly influential intentionally promoting fake news. And that's where social media companies have to take responsibility. They have developed systems that can flag disinformation or misinformation. And there's a responsibility on them to shut down accounts that deliberately spread fake news. And we have seen, and we have tested this, that social media platforms do not implement the same types of content moderation policies outside of the global north. And countries like South Africa are susceptible to disinformation, the spread of hate speech and incitements to violence, because of a lack of accountability of big tech platforms to actually remove harmful content.
Very well. Thank you so much for that. Legal Resources Centre's Regional Director, Sherylle Das, talking there about the importance of a misinformation campaign ahead of the elections next year.